And so before we kind of dive into the work, we just kind of want to talk about what the Educating for Democracy initiative is, because I don't know if everyone's familiar with it. It's a transdisciplinary initiative out of UVA that's in collaboration with the Center of Youth, Race and Public Education in the South, YouthNext, and the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And we really wanted to build free curricular resources for K-12 teachers around developmentally appropriate ways to engage students in issues of race and justice in the US context. And so the research theories, which you'll hear a little bit about today, social cognitive domain theory, social political development and civic engagement, and critical histories is what frames the work. And we're going to talk a little bit more about educating for democracy at the end of, and the materials that are available at the end of the conference today. And so to start, I think we can all agree that things aren't super great. And, we're in this kind of very contentious space in America. But the reality is, for many people, they haven't been great for a while. And so one thing that I always get really frustrated about is when people refer to, say, a presidency and say, this is when things shifted. But the reality is, for the kind of inception of America, we have been struggling for equity and justice, particularly marginalized groups. And so while it can be very daunting and very concerning and overwhelming, I do believe we're on the cusp of transformation. And in this process, though, we really need an active citizen body. We need people who can stand up and shape this democracy into one that we all value, and that one that values everyone within it. But we also have to acknowledge that all civic engagement is not good civic engagement. We're often talking about this in schools. That was one of the primary reasons schools were created, to create a citizen class. But we have to acknowledge that citizen engagement looks different for different people. And so, and it can be harmful if utilized in particular ways. And so, yes, we definitely want the students protesting for climate change, but this actually happened. This person in, I think it was Washington State, was protesting the vax mandate, so dressed in blackface to represent herself as Rosa Parks to protest the mandate. And so these are kind of instances that I would imagine, don't want our students to become. And the reality is, civic engagement from the past, it just simply won't age well. And if we look back at these pictures of people protesting school integration in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they were in their minds practicing their civic duties, so to speak. But we also know this won't age well. And so there's been a lot of scholarship on the different types of citizenship. And so we have the personally responsible citizen, and that's somebody who acts really responsibly in their community. This person focuses on obeying laws, and they believe that, to solve the problems in society, a person just has to make good choices. If you're of good character, then society as a whole will be of good character. We also have the participatory citizen, who kind of has those similar attributes of the personally responsible citizen, but they're also active in their community members. So this is the person, whereas for a personally responsible citizen, if there's a food drive, they will donate cans to the food drive. A participatory citizen might organize a food drive, and they're very active. They'll participate in, say, their school board meetings or local elections. Whereas the kind of justice-oriented citizen is really looking critically at the systems that we exist within. And so if it comes to that food drive, rather than just donating food or organizing it, they're questioning why do we need a food drive to begin with? What are the root causes of food insecurity? And so I want everybody to kind of take a second in the chat, and what type of citizenship do you think schools, K-12 schools, often encourage students to be? Personally responsible, participatory, justice-oriented? And you can just write your answer in the chat.
We have a lot of personally responsible, participatory, personally responsible at best.
Yeah.
participatory.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think that's really the focus of K-12 schooling is, that's what we see in these kind of character integration activities. It's like, how do we make people kind to each other? It's what my research began looking at. How do we make people kind? How do we get people to treat each other nicely? But I think we can all agree we really need to be focused on this justice-oriented citizen if we want to create these really equitable spaces that we all desire and will all benefit from. And so with that, we really are interested in this work we do with Educating for Democracy. How do we move from this kind of responsibility, this being reliable and doing what's expected to you, to this, where we look at like these structures and we work as a community to disrupt them. We work collectively to disrupt them. And to do this, we argue that we really need to understand developmental science when it comes to creating these justice-oriented citizens. And so just like we understand with children that the ways they learn math or reading looks differently at different age points, and we have to utilize different approaches and different skills, we believe the same thing when it comes to issues of justice and issues of equality. We have to understand how they're thinking about it and how they think about it in different ways at different points of development. And I want to start because, and I don't know if I failed to mention it, Educating for Democracy materials are grounded in race. We know there's a lot of inequity in the world, but we're really focused on race and racism. And one thing that we frequently hear is that, well, kids are too young to talk about race. Kids are not ready to have these conversations. But decades of research has told us that's not true. Starting as young as 3 months old, babies can distinguish between the race of their caregivers. Starting, going up to toddlerhood, they can choose playmates according to race. I have a son and he's 5 now, but I remember when he was in pre-K, he had 2 friends of different races, both named Daniel. And so the way he would refer to them, he was like, are you talking about white Daniel or black Daniel? And so like that's an example right there of how young children are using race to classify people, using race to group people. And it just kind of continues through development. And so really kind of grounding ourselves in understanding it's not if we can talk about it with them, it's how do we have these conversations. And so that's kind of where social cognitive domain theory comes into play. And it really argues that all students and adolescents are actively constructing meaning in the world. And so, it's this idea that students aren't passively sitting back and just kind of the teacher deposits information in them about what they should think about right or wrong. They're actively making sense of it. And it's kind of our job to help utilize it, help foster it, capitalize on their abilities. And within social cognitive domain theory, the theory asserts that the meaning they're making is really through this peer-to-peer interaction. So through dialogue with peers is really what's going to prompt their understandings rather than just direct teaching from myself as a teacher or a parent. It's really through the kind of peer-to-peer interaction. And so within social cognitive domain theory, there are 3 main domains: moral, social, conventional, and personal. And so the moral domain really is focused on issues of human welfare, rights, and justice. And to be very clear, this isn't about morality. This is about moral reasoning, which everybody kind of goes through, everybody develops understandings within. And it's really inherent features of interpersonal relationships. So how we think about issues of hitting or stealing, things that kind of affect the ways we relate to each other. Social conventional domain, on the other hand, is really focused on kind of social norms and expectations. So it's a bit arbitrary in nature and is really determined by social consensus and authority. And so, for example, depending on what kind of school you work in, students can call a teacher by their first name, or students have to call a teacher by their last name. You can call some family members, depending on the cultural context you exist in, you call like close family friends auntie or uncle if they're older than you, or you call them by their first name. And so, that's kind of the social convention domain. And then lastly, personal is related to kind of matters of preference or choice. So the right to decide, what your hairstyle is, the music you listen to, the friends you have. And so for the purposes of this, the purposes of Educating for Democracy work and the work we do in schools, we really focus on kind of the moral and social conventional domains, because those are key features of how we relate to each other, how we experience things, and the spaces in which equity and inequity either flourish or are disrupted. And so, as I kind of noted, peer-to-peer dialogue is the huge space where kids can develop meaning around these issues, rather than us as educators talking to them directly and telling them what or how they should think. We really want to give them space to engage in dialogue with each other. And research has shown that the most effective discussions are ones where students are actively working to transform these arguments, called transactive discussions. Also kind of understood as like communicative discourse. I love the idea that the argument is winning, not the individual or group, which is kind of different from debate as we traditionally know it. And so within transactive discussions, the students are doing one of three things. So they're either extending the logic of the argument, refuting the assumptions in the argument, or finding a place of commonality between two conflicting positions. And so that's what we really want to provide them opportunities to do when talking about these issues of race and injustice within the US context. And importantly, when we're having these discussions, we want to make sure they're domain concordant, meaning that we talked about the moral reasoning domain, the social conventional domain. We want to make sure the questions we're asking them to prompt these transactive discussions match the domain being addressed. And so, for example, hitting would, and you can write in the chat, and Zira can help me. Do you think an issue of hitting falls under the moral reasoning domain or the social conventional domain? Who has an idea in the chat? You win $100. No, you don't. Just kidding. But you could. Let's see. Anybody have moral? Yes. Thank you, Melanie. So yes, it's a moral issue. It's an issue of interpersonal relationships. So you wouldn't necessarily say if a child hits in class, oh, well, you shouldn't hit because it's against the rules. You would likely frame it as, you shouldn't hit because it makes Tommy feel bad. You shouldn't hit because it's unkind and hurts his feelings. Whereas chewing gum would be social conventional. It's really arbitrary. Some classrooms you can chew gum, other classrooms you can't chew gum. And so you wouldn't necessarily say, well, don't chew gum in the class because it really makes me feel bad. You would frame it in terms of the social norms of whatever context you're in. You shouldn't chew gum because it's against the rules. And so when it comes to the concerns of each domain, the ways that we can kind of think about these as educators and try to figure out, okay, which does this fall under? When it comes to moral reasoning, thinking about, does it affect the welfare of others? And would the transgression still be wrong if there was no rule about it? So chances are, whatever context you're in, whatever cultural context you're in, hitting is wrong, for example, even if there's no rule about it, while there might be different justifications for it. Whereas social conventional, the ways we kind of understand that is, if there was no rule about it, would the action still be wrong? And so is its primary purpose to organize systems and interactions between people. And so considering that, there's a lot of ones that overlap. And so can anybody type into a chat right now? And there's like $200 up for grabs. If there's any issues that we're dealing with right now that overlap between the moral reasoning and social conventional domains, any social issues that kind of come to mind. And there's a lot out there. Anyone have any ideas?
We have name calling.
Name calling, thank you. So that might fall into both, because it is, calling somebody outside their name, messing up their name, being a vegetarian. That's a good one. One that people frequently say when I talk about this work that's really relevant today is masking. So masking with COVID-19 and what that looks like. It is about organizing people, and it does affect the welfare of others. And so just how I've kind of talked about it, these discussions talked about kind of the developmental science of it. These discussions look very different at different ages. You know, how we're going to talk about, say, race and justice with a group of kindergartners is much different than the conversation we're going to have about it with a group of high schoolers. And so we really want to be mindful of that when we're engaging in these transactive dialogues.